Hello and welcome to Top Story. The Egyptian authorities moved on Tuesday to consolidate their power by ensuring that President Hosni Mubarak's National Democratic Party dominated the country's municipal elections. Party candidates ran uncontested in as many as 90% of the 52,600 seats up for grabs. The main opposition party, the Muslim Brotherhood, boycotted the elections and appealed to Egyptians not to vote after the authorities barred all but 20 of its 4,000 candidates. The Liberal Wafd party and the left-leaning Tagamu party suffered a similar fate. Local elections are virtually powerless in Egypt, but the elections have been given significance by a constitutional amendment of 2005 that requires presidential candidates to secure the support of at least 140 local councillors. Mubarak, who's 79 and serving his fourth term of office, is thought to be paving the way for his son Gamal to succeed him when he steps down in 2011. The elections took place against a background of strikes and riots over falling living standards. 250 arrests were made last week alone. Well, joining me now to discuss the significance of Tuesday's vote is Sophie Pommier, a lecturer at Sciences Po in Paris and author of a book entitled Egypt Beneath the Surface. Thanks very much for being on Top Story. What do these municipal elections tell us about Egypt under the reign of President Hosni Mubarak?
These elections are fully in line with the context that has been getting set up over the past 2 years between the most recent presidential and legislative elections at the end of 2005. It's blocking and locking down the whole political landscape, and the idea is to plan for two things to happen with the president's succession that you mentioned, because he will be 80 years old next year, and then an economic situation, an economic deadline, because since the 70s, from the time of Sadat, we've been working on a liberal or economic liberalization, trying to accelerate that as of 2004, and should now deal with some new steps, which will require a lot of subsidies to the necessity commodities, bread, for instance, which is an essential part of the
We've had riots in
foodstuffs.
We've had riots in Egypt in the last week or so, 250 arrests made, something like 500 over the course of this year. As you suggested, the standard of living is falling dramatically in Egypt. Is there a sign of panic, perhaps, on the side of the Egyptian government?
I wouldn't necessarily say panic, to the extent that these problems, in fact, should have been anticipated by the government. They were expected. This said, there is true fear on the part of the regime to be looking at a situation similar to what they experienced in '77 with the riots that were called the bread riots at the time, and also an initial attempt to try and impact these subsidies on this first commodity, the necessity. All of the precautions were taken, as I said earlier. The political landscape was locked down by a whole series of measures, including constitutional amendments that you mentioned, so that to the maximum amount, this could be held under control with a substantial reinforcement of security, preemptive arrests, and a lot of troops brought out there to maintain order, and also journalists being locked down.
The main target of the government appears to have been the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, what is it about the Muslim Brotherhood that appears to alarm the government so much?
Well, the problem concerning the Muslim Brotherhood is clearly that they are the most organized political force in terms of opposition. They cannot be considered a political party, and that, in fact, weakens them, but at the same time enables them to maintain credibility and legitimacy as regards the population, not being a part of the political system. But all political forces that that might be substantial there and need to be have legal status are filtered through the political system. So concretely, the Muslim Brotherhood is the only real structured force with a lot of presence throughout the country, and yet they are worrying the state. And I think that looking at a lot of the health departments and others, in fact, they are the dark horse of the regime. They're what the regime fears the most. In fact, they managed to win some 88 seats, and we see a bit of a movement. I'm not sure we should call it panic, keep things in perspective, but there's a bit of surprise to see the scope of their movement because the authorities had already locked down the vote during the most recent phases of consultation.
Now, the significance of this election has been increased somewhat by the fact that the constitution was changed in 2005 to make it essential that presidential candidates should have the support of local councillors. Now, what's all that about?
Well, perhaps this might be taken a bit out of perspective and it's been given a bit more importance. But these constitutional amendments, it's true that there are very strict conditions to be in the presidential election. You have to have some 5 years. All of these parties must support the candidates, must be in existence for some 5 years, or there have to be a certain number of signatures from already elected officials and these municipal councillors. So that does give a lot more stakes to these elections because of the concrete powers. These councillors, the power is very limited. But here is really where the true stakes are for these elections. But keep this in proportion, because even if the Muslim Brotherhood had massively won the municipal council positions, they would still be far away from being able to run for president. But all of this is important because what's happening here is we're seeing that the Egyptian government doesn't want to allow for any latitude. We're seeing that there's a lot of lessons to be learned here.
Now, very briefly, if you would, because we're running out of time, the United States government of George W. Bush made a big play of democratization in the Middle East. It doesn't seem to be happening in Egypt, does it?
Well, the problem for the American government and for the Western governments in general is that the regional situation is quite worrisome. We have Iraq, which is truly destabilized, Lebanon in a very difficult situation as well, Palestine, no need to even mention that. It's clear that for Westerners, new destabilization of another country, such as Egypt with its 67 million inhabitants, is something we cannot allow.
And that, I'm afraid, is where we have to end it. Thanks to our guest, Sophie Pommier. Join us again tomorrow for another edition of Top Story. Goodbye.